Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event entitled Should Anonymous Campaign Expenditures Be Allowed? And addressed by Representative Chris Van Hollen. I'm delighted that Representative Van Hollen joins us here at AEI. He was first elected to Congress in 2002 when he defeated in his primary the man who happens to be my next door neighbor, and who delightedly voted for him ever since until he got redistricted away from all of us in 2012. He's currently the top Democrat on the Budget Committee. He has distinguished himself as a leader and legislator for more than a decade. He's served on the Democratic leadership, including a stint as the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Most importantly for us, he's smart, serious, thoughtful, and exactly the kind of policymaker we like to welcome to here at AEI. The issue we're here to discuss today is the intersection of free speech and the disclosure of contributions to tax-exempt organizations that engage in campaign activities. Some of you may have been here. If you weren't, you may have heard that a year ago we heard one perspective from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and Congressman Van Hollen is here to represent the perspective outlined in his new legislation on the topic, which I recommend to you for your interest that you read, the Disclose Act. So we're looking forward to his remarks. Following his remarks, he will take his own questions and answers. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Chris Van Hollen.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you very much. Thank you, Arthur. And I want to thank AEI for the opportunity to join you today. And I want to thank Arthur Brooks for his strong and innovative leadership here at AEI. I've been pleased to join AEI on several previous occasions, including 2 years ago when I joined together with Congressman Paul Ryan to debate various budget issues. So I want to thank AEI for your commitment to the free exchange of ideas, which is such a vital part of a free society and strengthens our democracy and our economy. I'm here today not to discuss the budget, but to discuss a matter that goes to the heart of our democracy, and that is an open and transparent political process. Specifically, I want to make the case for a very straightforward proposition that the public should be informed about who is spending vast sums of money to influence their decision to vote for or against candidates for public office. I can tell you the public believes this information is important. Polls consistently show that over 85% of the public agrees that all political contributions and expenditures should be publicly disclosed. And this view is held by over 80% of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. In addition, while the ultimate decision in the Supreme Court's controversial 2010 Citizens United case was a close 5-4 split, 8 of the 9 justices gave full-throated support to disclosure, which they said, quote, brings transparency that enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and messages, unquote. Now, that brings me to what I'm not here to talk about. I'm not here to discuss and debate the final decision in that case. I disagreed with the court's ultimate decision in Citizens United, but for now, it is the law of the land. Nor am I here to talk about various campaign finance proposals that I think would improve our system. I'm here today to talk about the principle of disclosure, which until recently seemed to enjoy strong bipartisan support in the Congress. And I especially want to make this appeal here at AEI for 2 reasons. One is your commitment for the free exchange of ideas. And second, as Arthur mentioned, on 2 occasions, the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, has used this very podium in June 2012 and then in June 2013 to attack the idea that we should fully disclose to the public the sources of campaign expenditures used to try to defeat or elect candidates for federal office. And on both occasions, in 2012, 2013, he claimed to be opposing disclosure and transparency in order to protect free speech and the First Amendment. Here's what Senator McConnell said to you in June 2012, quote, "The attacks on speech are legion. Perhaps the most prominent is the so-called Disclose Act." He went on to say, quote, "Perhaps one of the most important thing Republicans did in the past few years was to block passage of the Disclose Act." Senator McConnell was back at this podium last June making similar statements. He said, and I quote, "The Disclose Act wasn't really about cleaning up politics. It was really about," he went on to say, "it's really about the left wing, quote, finding a blunt political weapon to use against one group and one group only, conservatives," end quote. That's what Senator McConnell said here last year. Now, here's why I want to talk to you. I am the author of the Disclose Act that passed the House of Representatives in 2010, and the author of a revised version of the Disclose Act that's pending in the House today. So I must be that scary lefty that Senator McConnell is talking about, and I'm here to tell you that his analysis, to put it diplomatically, is a bunch of nonsense. And I really hope that many of you in this room, regardless of your political persuasion, and those who are watching, can help get us back to a time that the bipartisan consensus that exists around the country on this issue will reemerge on Capitol Hill. And who better to cite for my own position today than Senator McConnell himself? Not the Senator McConnell 2012 and 2013 here at AEI, but the Senator McConnell who spoke to the nation on Meet the Press in the year 2000. And it's very important to understand the context of his statements at that time. The Senate had just voted on June 9th, 2000, by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 92-6 to require groups organized under 527 of the tax code to publicly disclose their political expenditures on behalf of candidates. 527s include all political action committees and currently include what are known as super PACs. Now, Senator McConnell was one of the 6 to vote against that 527 disclosure, but he justified his opposition on the grounds that the disclosure requirement did not extend to more groups. Here is what Senator McConnell said on Meet the Press 9 days after that Senate vote. Quote, he mentions the Senate vote and said that if you're going to require disclosure, quote, it needs to be meaningful disclosure. 527s are just a handful of groups. We need to have real disclosure. And so what we ought to do is broaden the disclosure to include at least labor unions and tax-exempt business associations, so you include the major political players in America. Why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure, he asked on Meet the Press. Indeed, why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? I agree with what Senator McConnell said, and the American people agree, and that's what the Disclose Act does. It calls for disclosure not just by 527s, but by the other groups Senator McConnell said should be included. Now, since his statement on Meet the Press, Senator McConnell has totally flip-flopped on disclosure. He has gone from saying we need more disclosure to arguing that more disclosure is some left-wing conspiracy to end free speech. He led the filibuster that blocked the vote on the Senate version of the Disclose Act in 2010. 59 senators voted to proceed with the vote, but it was blocked by Senator McConnell and a minority of 41 senators. Since then, I have introduced revised versions of the Disclose Act in both the last Congress and this Congress that addressed some of the concerns that Senator McConnell had earlier raised. But his opposition to transparency and disclosure has only hardened. Let's look at the objections that Senator McConnell raised here at AEI over the last 2 years. First, he argued that the Disclose Act requires disclosure on a selective basis, that it requires disclosure only from conservative and Republican-leaning groups and not liberal or Democratic-affiliated groups. That's simply untrue. I have here in my hand a copy of the Disclose Act I've introduced in the House of Representatives. And I challenge Senator McConnell or anybody else to show me where it selectively targets conservative groups. This bill requires disclosure by all groups spending money to elect or defeat candidates regardless of their political leanings. And I invite Senator McConnell to suggest any changes he thinks are necessary to ensure that it applies in a uniform manner. Now, I don't expect the phone to ring. I don't expect to get a call from the senator anytime soon. And that is because the claim of selectivity is a red herring. In fact, the real selectivity problem is the one Senator McConnell raised in 2000 on Meet the Press, when he said we shouldn't selectively limit disclosure to 527s, that the disclosure requirement should apply more broadly. Remember, he said, why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? And the Disclose Act does exactly what he recommended. It expands disclosure beyond 527s to other groups. Second, Senator McConnell says he now opposes disclosure because it will hurt our democracy and undermine free speech by exposing people who spend money in election campaigns to such awful harassment that it effectively denies them their First Amendment right to free speech. And in his speech here at AEI, he urged all of you to read Justice Thomas's partial dissent in Citizens United on this very matter. In doing so, Senator McConnell failed to disclose that all of the other 8 justices in Citizens United rejected that argument, and that the Supreme Court has already developed mechanisms to address cases of extreme and demonstrable oppression. The Supreme Court, in cases ranging from Buckley v. Vallejo to Citizens United to the recent McCutcheon case, have repeatedly argued that the disclosure of campaign contributions and expenditures advance important public interests. And the court has rejected the arguments put forward by Senator McConnell and Justice Thomas. The courts have put forward 3 main arguments in favor of disclosure. 1, the public interest in knowing who is spending money to try to influence their votes. 2, that transparency serves an important anti-corruption interest. And 3, that disclosure helps to enforce other campaign finance laws, like the prohibition on foreigners or foreign-owned corporations spending money in U.S. elections. Here's what the Supreme Court said in Buckley with respect to disclosure of both direct contributions to campaigns and independent expenditures. I quote, "Disclosure requirements deter actual corruption and avoid the appearance of corruption by exposing large contributions and expenditures to the light of publicity. A public armed with information about a candidate's most generous supporters is better able to detect any post-election special favors that may be given in return." In Citizens United, 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices, including Justices Roberts, Kennedy, Scalia, and Alito, found that disclosure requirements for independent spending groups, quote, "do not prevent anyone from speaking," end quote, and serve the important public interest of, quote, "providing the electorate with information about elected-related spending sources," end quote. They said this, again I quote, "allows voters to make informed decisions in the political marketplace." As AEI's Norm Ornstein has pointed out, it is clear from Justice Kennedy's opinion that disclosure was a key factor in unlocking the rest of the Citizens United decision. That disclosure was the counterweight to the expansion of money into the electioneering efforts of corporations and other groups. And those 8 justices went on to say, and I quote, "With the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporation's interest in making profits, and citizens can see whether elected officials are, quote, in the pocket of so-called money interests." That was 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices. Those are the big left-wingers trumpeting the benefits of disclosure and transparency. If you look at the recent McCutcheon case, the court again reaffirmed the importance of disclosure, citing their earlier precedents. Now, in its decision, the court has addressed the specific concerns raised by Senator McConnell and Justice Thomas. Justice Thomas observed that in the 1958 case of NAACP versus Alabama, the court declared that Alabama's law requiring individuals to disclose their contributions to the NAACP infringed on the right of free association because it exposed those individuals to physical severe threats and retribution. The court in the NAACP case put forward a strict test for groups seeking to avoid disclosure. And in the later 1976 Buckley decision, the court rejected a challenge to disclosure requirements based on that earlier NAACP case. The Buckley court found that the strict test for avoiding disclosure in NAACP did not void the campaign finance disclosure requirements that they upheld in Buckley. And the Buckley court did say that a group could seek an exemption from the disclosure requirements if it could demonstrate, as the NAACP did in the Alabama case, that it would be subjected to an actual, not speculative, burden on the freedom of association. And in fact, the FEC has determined that one group, the Socialist Workers' Party, which they found faced a history of violence, harassment, and threats, quote, has met that test and exempted them from current disclosure requirements. I also want to emphasize that the Disclose Act addresses these concerns. It does not threaten freedom of association in any way. Any organization can continue to receive anonymous contributions to support their general mission. However, to the extent the organization wants to spend money to elect or defeat candidates, they could set up a separate election spending account and disclose the sources of contributions above $1,000 to that account. Moreover, the Disclose Act does not displace the current law that allows groups to avoid even those disclosure requirements if they can meet the strict test established by the Buckley court. But it's a tough test. As Justice Scalia wrote in his concurring opinion in the Doe v. Reed case that upheld disclosure requirements in a case about petitioner signers for ballot measures, which is a less compelling situation than one for disclosure of political contributions, Justice Scalia wrote, quote, "Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed." That's Justice Scalia. Now, you can't avoid disclosure because you might get your feelings hurt or face a public backlash. George Soros has been subjected to lots of criticism, as have the Koch brothers. That's part of the rough and tumble of a vibrant democracy and a spirited debate. Individuals and corporations should not be able to spend millions of dollars on TV ads beating up or praising candidates without telling the public who they are. As Justice Scalia said, that state of affairs, quote, "does not resemble the home of the brave," unquote. Finally, Senator McConnell has been conveniently inconsistent in his application of his concern about the alleged harm of disclosure. Currently, candidates for federal office must disclose all the contributions their campaigns receive above $200 up to the current limit of $2,600 per election. And Senator McConnell says he is still in favor of those disclosures and the disclosure of contributions to political party organizations. So I ask you, why is it in the public interest to require disclosure of a $200 contribution to a candidate's political campaign and not in the public interest to disclose a $200 million expenditure to elect or defeat that candidate? Why is it okay to subject people who contribute $200 directly to a candidate's campaign to this alleged infringement of First Amendment rights, but not corporations or individuals who spend millions of dollars to elect or defeat a candidate? That is a total double standard. So it's time for Senator McConnell to stop saying that the Disclose Act is some kind of lefty conspiracy or pretend that it's designed to squelch free speech. It is designed to accomplish what he previously said he supported: more disclosure, not less. And the fastest way to implement the public support for broad disclosure and transparency would be to pass the current version of the Disclose Act. And as I said earlier, I'd be more than happy to work with Senator McConnell to resolve any legitimate concerns. Now, in the meantime, because of the lack of congressional action on the Disclose Act, there are other efforts underway to address big pieces of this issue. The fastest way to do that is to look at some of the issues relating to 501c4s. Because the one thing that has received the most attention deals with the IRS regulations regarding these organizations, 501c4s, that include groups like Karl Rove's Crossroads GPS that supports Republican candidates, and the Priorities USA group that supported President Obama in the 2012 election. Why have these 501c4 groups gotten so much attention in the aftermath of the Citizens United decision? Because in Citizens United, the Supreme Court struck down laws that barred corporations from spending money to elect or defeat candidates for federal office. As a result, for-profit corporations and not-for-profit corporations can spend monies on these elections, and the C in 501c4 stands for corporation. And 501c4s have become the primary vehicle of choice for individuals and corporations that do not want to disclose to the public the monies they spend to try and influence the public's vote. Indeed, Crossroads, for example, has two distinct organizational forms. First, there's American Crossroads Super PAC, which is organized under 527 of the IRS Code. The second is Crossroads GPS, organized under Section 501c4 of the IRS Code. So what's the main difference? Remember, I earlier mentioned that bipartisan 92-6 vote in the Senate in June 2000 that required 527s to disclose their donors? They have to disclose. If you give to a 527 Super PAC, whether it's American Crossroads or whether it's a Democratic-leaning Super PAC, contributions are disclosed. But that disclosure requirement passed in 2000 does not apply to 501c4s. There was less focus on requiring disclosure from such corporations since prior to the 2010 Citizens United decision, they were not allowed to spend any money for the express purpose of electing or defeating a candidate, although they were slowly emerging as vehicles used for what are known as sham issue ads designed as focusing on an issue but really disguised as focusing on an issue but really designed to support or defeat a candidate. Now, remember, in 2000, Senator McConnell justified his opposition to requiring 527s to disclose on the ground that we should have more disclosure, not less. In fact, he said we should require disclosure from all, and I quote, the major political players in America, unquote. Well, it is indisputable that in the aftermath of Citizens United, 501c4s are major political players. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, the amount of secret money being spent by 501c4s shot up from virtually nothing before 2006 to over $256 million in the 2012 election cycle, which comprises 85% of the $300 million in total secret money spent in 2012. So there you have it. If you want to hide money being spent to elect or defeat candidates, give it to a 501c4. Indeed, Carl Forte, the political director of Crossroads GPS, has acknowledged that 501c4s, their 501c4 was formed, quote, because some donors didn't want to be disclosed. Now, there is a catch that explains the underlying reason for all the recent focus on IRS actions relating to 501c4s. Under the IRS, and just bear with me because it's a little twisted story, but it's really important, I think, that everybody understand this. Under the IRS guidelines that have been in place since the 1950s, an organization can qualify for 501c4 status so long as its, quote, primary purpose is social welfare and education. Those are the 1950s regulations from the IRS. But if the organization spends more than 49%, so that has to be social welfare, primary purpose. So if they spend more than 49% on political activities, non-social welfare activities, like now trying to elect or defeat candidates, that organization is not eligible for 501c4 status. This means that in order to enforce the guidelines, the IRS has to examine the activities of these organizations to determine if they meet the requirements. And after Citizens United, the IRS faced an explosion of applications from groups applying as 501c4s. The applications jumped from 752 in 2010 to 3,357 in 2012, a 90% jump. That's why you hear these stories about the IRS seeking information from groups about their activities. Now, obviously the IRS should and must apply these rules in a uniform way. But in my view, we should never have involved the IRS in the business of having to investigate organizations on the right or the left to make these determinations. And here's the really interesting thing. The underlying statute, the written law passed by Congress, never envisioned putting the IRS in that position. The statute never called for the primary purpose test the IRS developed by regulation in the 1950s. Indeed, Section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code, the statute, provides the tax exemption to, and I quote, civic leagues of organizations not organized for profit, but operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. It doesn't say a 501c4 should be engaged primarily in social welfare activities, but can spend 49% of its funds on political activity. Doesn't say that. And I don't know of any dictionary where exclusively has come to mean primarily. And here's the other thing everyone in this room should be able to agree on. That while there may be a fuzzy line between what constitutes social welfare activities versus certain political activities involving issue advocacy, under no circumstances does the intended definition of social welfare activity include spending money to defeat or elect candidates for public office. In fact, the IRS regulations state clearly that, quote, the promotion of social welfare does not include direct or indirect participation in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office. So you have a situation where the plain meaning of the IRS code, the statute as written by Congress, never envisioned these 501c4 organizations spending a dime to help elect or defeat candidates for public office. And yet they are now being used to funnel millions of dollars of undisclosed monies for that purpose. Nobody really paid much attention to this discrepancy between the written law and the IRS guidelines until after Citizens United, because until then, even under the primary purpose test, no corporation could spend money for the express purpose of electing or defeating candidates. Citizens United changed that. And now, as more and more 501c4s get into the business of spending secret money to elect or defeat candidates, the discrepancy has become glaring. So glaring that in April of last year, I sued the IRS to enforce the plain meaning of the written statute. I would also point out that the Inspector General of the IRS, who issued the report entitled "Inappropriate Criteria Were Used to Identify Tax-Exempt Applications for Review," also recommended that the IRS look into the measure of primary activity. Since then, the IRS has begun to review this discrepancy, and as a result, our lawsuit has been withdrawn, at least for now. But please do not fall for the partisan tripe that this IRS review is some kind of political conspiracy to silence conservative groups. The reality is that these groups are now being used on the right and the left for a purpose that was never intended: to funnel undisclosed monies into political election campaigns. If you want to spend unlimited amounts of money to defeat or elect candidates for public office, there's a simple choice. Give it to a 527 organization. As we've discussed, the difference is that 527s are required to disclose to the public. Let me end with an appeal to work on a bipartisan basis to restore some faith in the campaign finance process by providing for the disclosure and transparency supported across party lines by over 85% of the American public and by 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in Citizens United. In 2007, now Speaker Boehner said, and I quote, "We ought to have full disclosure." In 2010, Representative Cantor, now the Republican leader, said that, and I quote, "Anything that moves us back towards that notion of transparency and real-time reporting of donations and contributions, I think would be a helpful move toward restoring the confidence of voters," end quote. And in 2010, Representative McCarthy, now the Republican whip, said, and I quote, "The best way, the fairest way is greater transparency. Let people understand where it," meaning the money, "is going and what is happening." Now that these 3 gentlemen are the 3 most powerful members of the Republican majority in the House, the American people really should get a vote on the Disclose Act, or a version of it. Why should the public continue to be kept in the dark about who is spending gobs of money to influence their choice of candidates? After all, it was Senator McConnell who said, "Why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure?" Indeed, why would it? Let's do something about it. And as I said to Arthur earlier, if Senator McConnell wants to come back here to AEI for the 3rd time this year to discuss this matter, I would be happy to join him here at this podium. Let's get this done for the country and the American people and the strength of our democracy. Thank you all very much for your attention. And I'd be happy to try and answer any questions. Yeah.
Gerald Chandler, would you apply disclosure to an individual? Suppose I had $100 million. I went to an advertising agency and I say, "I want you to do the best you can to tear down the character of the Koch brothers," or some other thing. Would that have to be disclosed?
Look, let me agree with one thing. There are different gradations of when disclosure may or not be appropriate. What I'm focused on right now is an area where historically we've all agreed it's been appropriate, and the Supreme Court has judged it to be appropriate. That's when you're giving money for the purpose of electing or defeating candidates, whether it's direct or, frankly, indirect in certain cases. In terms of other hypotheticals, I'd have to take the time to think it through. I mean, I'd have to think through all the implications. What I'm talking about here is something where I think there's broad agreement. At least there used to be broad agreement. But yes, you can imagine lots of different scenarios in local jurisdictions or states where they may pass local ordinance or laws requiring disclosure. And I would argue you've got to go through on a case-by-case basis to see whether it's appropriate. I also want to point out, again, that the Disclose Act actually allows for these anonymous contributions to an organization so long it's in accordance with its, that primary purpose. And it creates a special ability for that organization to create a special account if it wants to get involved in campaign activities directly spending to defeat or elect candidates. So the answer is, I'd have to look at other hypotheticals on a factual basis. But what I'm talking about today is something that's enjoyed broad bipartisan support, has been examined by the Supreme Court. 8 of the 9 justices came down on the side that I'm talking about. Yeah. No.
Thanks. Norm Ornstein from AEI. There's one area that you didn't mention very much. As you noted, Congress in 2000 did act to enhance disclosure. There was a significant amount of it in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. We've had these Supreme Court rulings, but the Federal Election Commission has issued regulations that basically have narrowed disclosure to a level that is almost absurdly impossible to meet, that it's people giving money specifically for an advertisement. Now, I know that you sued as well the Federal Election Commission. You're a very litigious guy.
When it comes to disclosure, I am. You're right.
And that, and in repeated instances you have, and judges have rebuffed those regulations. But in this particular case, a district court judge did so, and then a panel of the D.C. Circuit sent it back. Could you talk for just a couple of minutes about the dysfunction of the Federal Election Commission and its role in the problems that we have, but also the state of play in that particular lawsuit?
Sure. And let me start with the latter, the state of play in that case, because you're right. We essentially won the case at the federal district court level. On appeal, the court actually found against us in part, but then sent the case back to the federal district court level to look at the other piece of the case. And in fact, it's pending as we're gathered here now, and we have some hope and optimism that the judge will weigh all the equities, and we think it's pretty clear it's on our side, which is because, as you indicated, it's another case where the regulations do not comply with the plain meaning of the statute. Very similar to this situation. What the statute says is that if you make that contribution and they spend it for it should be disclosed. But what the regulations did was narrow it to say it's only disclosed if I, as an individual, essentially say, here's my contribution and I want it spent for political purposes in a particular election. That's not what the law says. That's the way it was defined. And so, yes, we're hopeful that the court will, again, say that the regulation does not comply with the plain meaning of the statute and overturn that. With respect to the FEC, as you know, it's a dysfunctional organization. Unfortunately, it has become very polarized, and obviously everyone sees the equities differently. But again, when it comes to, I was pleased that the FEC did not actually challenge, if I recall correctly, our lawsuit in that case. Now, maybe some of them tried, but it was deadlocked on a challenge. But Norm, I don't have a very good answer to how we can resurrect the FBC. I think right now, for those of us who believe in disclosure, along with 85+% of the American people and 8 of the 9 Supreme Court Justices United, we're going to have to pursue these other areas. Now, I focused on 501c4s because they've been so much in the news lately, but you also have other 501c organizations, right? 501c5, 6s, and they do represent some of the other secret money flowing into these campaigns. I mentioned that there's $300 million of secret money flowing into these campaigns. In fact, Justice Roberts cited that figure in his McCutcheon case. 256 million of that 300 million is from 501c4s. That's what the IRS review is getting at. But the Disclose Act gets at everybody, right? And so that's why it's the simplest, cleanest way to deal with this, because it addresses, frankly, the broad range of issues that the 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices discussed in Citizens United. Yes?
Thank you, Congressman Hollen. Leon Peace Consulting. What impact, if any, do you envision your legislation having on the learner matter that's before Congress? On the learner matter that's currently before Congress, the lowest learner, the IRS.
I'm sorry, on the lowest learner matter?
Yes.
The legislation is not related to the learner matter, right? I mean, the issue in the learner matter goes to this question of how the IRS went about trying to make determinations about whether the primary purpose of these 501c4 organizations was social welfare or whether their primary purpose was political. And as I indicated, after Citizens United, you had a flood of new applications for 501c4s, a 90% increase. So here's the IRS that's supposed to make this determination under the regulations, a determination that was never established by statute, as I said. And if you're the IRS, folks, wherever you are in the country, and you're getting these applications, how are you supposed to go about making that determination? You've got to ask the 501c4 for its documents, for what it does, right? And then you've got to first determine whether it's political activity or social welfare, and then under the misguided and frankly under the statute, under the regulation never supported by the statute, you got to determine whether that is 51% or 49%. So what the IRS did was they got this flood of applicants. They began to put out these sort of phrases to try and capture groups that they thought may be involved in political activity more than social welfare activity. And they bungled it. They went and they put in key phrase Tea Party. I will say they also put in key phrase progressive groups. It happened that there were a lot more applications coming in, I believe, probably on the right-leaning groups than the left, but they put in those key words as a shortcut because they were getting flooded with these applications. Now, it's inappropriate to have a keyword, but my point here is the IRS was never intended to be in that business in the first place. Under the statute, you didn't have a primary purpose test. So the IRS didn't have to go around saying, are you 51% social welfare or are you 51% political? They said exclusively for the purpose of social welfare activity, right? So that's why it's important that we get back to the plain meaning of the law. That's why we filed the lawsuit against the IRS, and that's why I hope they finally get it right, and then we'll avoid these other issues. Yeah.
Luke Walkup from the Center for Competitive Politics. You speak about the broad bipartisan support for disclosure and hopes that it will reemerge on Capitol Hill, and you referred several times to the 8 of 9 Citizens United justices endorsing disclosure. But aren't those justices, and isn't that broad bipartisan support for the existing regime of disclosure, which exists for primarily political organizations, contributions and expenditures by candidates, parties, PACs, and super PACs? isn't it different to do what the Disclose Act puts forward to push disclosure into organizations that are not primarily political, such as nonprofits or business associations? So is the disagreement we're seeing truly new, or have proponents of disclosure just sort of move the goalpost and push the conversation into a new area compared to what support for disclosure was in the past?
No, no one's moved the goalpost. If you go back to Buckley v. Vallejo, they looked at these issues, and they found, for the reasons that I described, that disclosure not just of contributions but of independent expenditures was in the public interest. Again, why? Because voters have a public interest in knowing who is spending millions of dollars to try and influence their vote. Because transparency provides for an anti-corruption safeguard. And as I said, because it also allows greater ability to enforce other parts of campaign finance law, like our law prohibiting foreigners and foreign corporations from spending money in U.S. elections. By the way, a foreign corporation can contribute to a 501c4, right? So disclosure helps us enforce that prohibition. They can give it to the 501c4, but right now, how do you know whether the 501c4 is not using those foreign corporation monies for political purposes? Again, that's one of the three main reasons the courts have talked about disclosure. And in Citizens United, the 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices also talk more broadly about disclosure, way beyond contributions to political campaigns. They're very clear on that point, crystal clear. In fact, I quoted a section where they also talked about shareholder, right? Corporate disclosure to their shareholders. That's in the Supreme Court. Current law doesn't require that. Our Disclose Act would require that. It would require corporations to notify their shareholders about political contributions they're making, which, as 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices said, would allow shareholders to determine whether or not the corporation was pursuing their shareholder interests. So there's a situation where the Supreme Court went out of its way to talk about the benefits of expanded disclosure that we don't have under current law. No, the record is very clear where the court is on this. And they have discussed the issues that have been raised by Senator McConnell, and they specifically addressed and debated the issues raised by Justice Thomas, and they have rejected them. What is different is that, as I said, before Citizens United, you didn't have the issue of 501c4s spending money directly to try and elect or defeat candidates, right? They were, by statute, corporations, and 501c4s are nonprofit corporations. By statute, they were prohibited from doing that. So there was no disclosure regime in place for that. But there was. Congress made a very intentional decision in that 2000 vote to require disclosure of 527s that were involved in spending money to elect or defeat candidates, right? But 501c4s at that time were not allowed to do it. It was only after Citizens United that that became a big issue, at least with respect to direct advocacy. As I indicated, there's a whole nother issue related to, what I refer to as sham issue ads, and that's a whole nother conversation. But again, the court has been crystal clear that this disclosure requirement is good for democracy, not just disclosure of contributions to people's political campaigns, but the expenditures of monies to try to elect, defeat candidates. Very clear. Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm back.
Thanks. Steve Luckett, I work and study here in the city. Thanks a lot, Congressman, for joining us. Good to see you as always. And since he's here, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Arthur for having you, and the Dalai Lama and Bill Gates. You are in very good company. We assume he's going to have the Pope here soon, so hopefully. Well, what do you say, sir, to people who view, McCutcheon, Citizens United, as another move by the court to become very pro-business in the ways and the groups that it will grant cert to?
Well, let me just say, I mentioned at the outset that while I had issues with the ultimate decision, Citizens United, my focus here today was on disclosure. But since you raised the issue, Look, there are serious questions that go all the way back to Buckley v. Vallejo, at which point in time the court essentially equated the expenditure of millions of dollars by one individual with free speech. And so you've seen this, steady rise of money being, more and more money being pushed into politics and organizations. Now, my point here today, we can have a long debate about Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United and the fact that it equated, the free speech rights of corporations with that of individuals for the purpose of political giving. I'd love to have that debate. What I really wanted to focus on today was an area where there has been political consensus in the past. And as I cited, quotes from a lot of my colleagues who are now the three most powerful members of the House Republican majority, I've quoted Senator McConnell's own statements about more disclosure is better than less disclosure. All that relates here to disclosure. And so I really hope that fair-minded people who actually dig down into all the twists and turns of this story will dismiss what I think have been some obviously blatant, politically convenient remarks by some people about disclosure. I mean, it's just wrong for Senator McConnell to stand at this podium and say that the purpose of the Disclose Act is to go after conservative and right-leaning groups. I mean, again, I got the bill right here. Show me, Senator McConnell, where it does that, right? And I'll work with him to address any concerns. The reality is that there aren't any, and it's been widely discussed. So I want to focus on that issue. I should also say I'm really pleased that my wife, Catherine, is here this afternoon, who requires full disclosure. Yes.
I'm Ken Doyle from BNA. I just have a question about assuming the Disclose Act doesn't pass soon, or there are other legislative developments, which it doesn't look like there are going to be. How do you see this developing in the current election cycle in terms of the, in the last election there were more Republican groups that were interested in, that were active in supporting candidates. Do you think that there's going to be more evenness among Democrats and Republicans, a lot more Democratic groups that are getting involved in this?
Well, a couple things. First, on your initial statement, I agree with you that at least based on the current position of Speaker Boehner, who, again, was for disclosure before he's against it, and the position of Senator McConnell and enough Republican senators to filibuster it, that unfortunately prospects in this Congress of passage of the Disclose Act are not great, which is why I decided to spend that time I did on the issue of the 501c4s and IRS regulations, because while, as I said, it doesn't constitute all of secret spending, it constitutes the overwhelming majority of secret spending through 501c4s, and that is an active issue going on right now. And as I said, if they don't meet the test, we of course reserve the right to refile our lawsuit, because this is a case where the plain meaning of the law is so clear. Now, in the meantime, look, I mean, the nature of politics is that people will look at their opportunities in terms of how they're going to be raising money and participating in the political process. I don't know how this will play out. As you indicated, for whatever reason, a lot of groups on the right have chosen 501c4s, but there are also groups on the left who have chosen 501c4s, and it's perfectly possible that that will increase over time. I don't know. All I know is that I think that whether it's on the right or the left, the public purpose is served by disclosure, and that's why I wanted to focus on that today. Thank you very much. Thanks. Sure. I think so. I'll have to chat. A little lunch? All right.